I think, you always say people need no introduction. I think in this case, if you're not familiar with our two speakers, you probably shouldn't be in the room. So I'm going to read through the introductions of both of them, and then Professor Wolff will speak first, and then Professor Bartol, and we're all looking forward to hearing from them. Larry Wolff is at New York University, where he's the Julius Silver Professor of History and co-director of the NYU Florence at Villa La Pieta. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His most recent books are Woodrow Wilson and the Reimagining of Eastern Europe, 2020, and Disunion Within the Union, the Uniate Church, and the Partitions of Poland, 2019. Among his other books are The Idea of Galicia, History and Fantasy in Habsburg Political Culture, Venice and the Slavs, The Discovery of Dalmatia in the Age of Enlightenment, Inventing Eastern Europe, The Map of Civilization, On the Mind of the Enlightenment, and others. And his topic today is Galicia after Galicia, the fantasies and phantoms of the Galician legacy. Please.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to address the conference. It's an honor for me. And I have to say that I'm very humbled by all the expertise that's in the room. I know I'm speaking to people who, many of whom know this subject better than I do, many of whom I have learned about this subject from by reading their work over the course of the last decades of my academic life, and you may recognize yourselves and your work in my lecture. The title Galicia after Galicia is meant to be a play upon Nicolas Jorga's work Byzance après Byzance, the ways in which to think about a cultural legacy. And the Jorga reference is not wrong for Galicia, since it does in fact have a Byzantine aspect and is part of the Byzance après Byzance that Jorga meant to signify. In this group, I hardly need to point out to you where Galicia is in the northeastern frontier of the Habsburg monarchy, nor do I need to point out to you that on the ethnic maps of the 19th and 20th century, it was divided into different language groups, Polish and Ukrainian, with a counting of its different religious groups as well, including the Jews, the Greek Catholics, and the Roman Catholics of Galicia. Hardly need to tell you that part of the former Galicia is today in Poland and part of it is in Ukraine, nor to tell you that it exists as a kind of shadow aspect in both of those countries, and that Galicia is effectively at war at this moment, although you're unlikely to read about Galicia in the war coverage of the present moment. That said, I want to come to the early moment of Galicia after Galicia, the moment in the 1920s when Galicia has just ceased to exist in 1918, and the great German modernist writer Alfred Döblin makes a Reise in Polen, right? Because Galician is not there anymore. He travels in 1924, he publishes in 1926, and Galician is one of the things that he discovers in Poland when he travels in the early 20s, because of course it was very recent at that moment. This Galician city, he means Lviv, is completely different from the cities of Congress Poland. The people here are soft and friendly. The people of Warsaw were rigid, drilled in the Russian style. Who could that man be made of red sandstone sitting on that chair up there? Alexander Fredro, it says on the monument. He must be long dead, for he has no steel pen but a goose feather for writing in his hand. I want you to notice the way that for Döblin, Galicia already feels like long ago, right? It's the days of writing with goose feathers. And the name of Fredro is unrecognizable to him when he travels. It's already a work of archaeology for him to uncover the Galicia that lies underneath the Poland that he's visiting. Fredro did not die hundreds of years ago. He had died in 1876, just 50 years earlier. Fredro, who was present in the very earliest years of Galicia. He was born at the time that Galicia was being formed in the 1790s. As a very young man, he fought in what the Franco-Galician army in the Napoleonic Wars, or the Galicio-French army, as he says, Francusco-Galiciskiego or Galicisco-Francuskiego. He doesn't remember exactly which. I want to remind you that the ways in which Galicia takes a hyphen. That is to say, we speak about Galician Jewish, we speak about Galician Polish, we speak about Galician Ukrainian, but I want you to notice how free-floating it was in the earliest period. Galician French was thinkable for Fredro in the early 19th century moment of the Napoleonic Wars. That statue of Fredro, it's in Wrocław today, along with the Polish population that was moved from Lwów to Wrocław. The statue of Fredro followed, and you would now find Galicia, you would find Fredro as a signifier of Galicia located there. I want to emphasize that this is a movable legacy, this Galician legacy. It's not fixed in one place. After 1918, it floats, and of course we are constituting a piece of that legacy as we discuss Galicia here right now in Jerusalem. Fredro's the author of many wonderful comedies. He's the great Polish comic playwright of the 19th century. Dożywocie, or Life Annuity, is a play about a miser in Lviv in the early 19th century who buys a life annuity for a young man whose life he must therefore then secretly protect in order to profit from the annuity. And the young man writes, for more than a year now, some hidden powers that's always with me, guarding every step I take, helps me out of every trouble. We might imagine it as a kind of fantasy, a comic rendering of the imperial relation between Metternich's Vienna and the Galician Habsburg province, the kind of protective proprietary interest that might be taken in a province. Though when the play is performed, that poster that you're looking at right there, June 2nd, 1989, 2 days before the Polish elections of 1989, which were about to transform Poland completely. What I want to emphasize is that the fantasy, or the somewhat dark fantasy of a surveillance society, is one that could be transplanted from its creation in Metternich's Europe to the very last days of Cold War Europe in the late 1980s. Again, I'd want to stress this idea of a movable legacy. Here, back to Dublin. These Europeans, these half and whole ones, I already fear that there will be cafes here, that people will follow literature, that they will talk about Tagore, again and again, the Viennese waltz. In the hall they are singing along. Is there a heart or a soul in them? For Dublin, the Europeanness of Lviv is already something that he finds disturbing and uncomfortable, especially the Viennese aspects of that Europeanness. And of course, Lviv was and remains a city of cafes. You've probably been there, even to the Viennese cafe with the portrait of Franz Josef on the wall, this is photographed from the early 21st century, signifying a Galician legacy that was already almost 100 years old at that time. I want to say a few words about Lviv. I'm very happy that our scholars from Lviv have arrived and are here at the conference. It's a city that's been important to me for thinking about Galicia over the years. I wanted to begin with the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II arriving in Lviv in 1773 at the moment of the creation of Galicia in the first partition of Poland, 1772. was just discussing with Professor Bartal how providential it seems to be that we are now holding this conference at the 250th anniversary of the creation of Galicia in 1772, though that was not the original intention when the conference was originally planned. The COVID delay has somehow created this calendar anniversary for us. Me voilà donc au milieu des Sarmates. Here I am among the Sarmatians, says Joseph II. It's incredible, everything that there is to do here, tout ce que l'on trouve à faire ici. It's a confusion that has no comparison, he says. I want you to notice here that he doesn't really have a word yet for Galicia in 1773. He describes it as being among the Sarmatians for him. And when his mother, Maria Theresa, writes to him, she writes to him, in de Karpaten, right, in the mountains, right? They don't quite have a comfortable designation yet. The term is too new at the moment, but it's a project for him already. So much to do here, right? For Joseph, here, as elsewhere in the monarchy, every place is a project. And here, where everything is to be done, right, it becomes a kind of millenarian project. I do want to emphasize that for me, Galicia is invented in 1772. There is, of course, a medieval kingdom of Halich. I would probably downplay the continuities from the Middle Ages to the 18th century. There is an overlap of territory. I would see the creation of Habsburg Galicia as something fundamentally new and distinctive, in which the name was borrowed from the medieval past as a convenience and as a way of creating a kind of fictive legitimacy for the Habsburgs. For that reason, when I was in the Israel Museum yesterday, what a great museum it is, looking at the Horb Synagogue, which is recreated there with its very beautiful painted ceiling, I was a little taken aback to see on the wall text that the very little remains of the wall decorations, right? They have the ceiling decorations. The paintings date from 1735 and are the work of Eliezer Sussman, a well-known Galician Jewish artist who specialized in synagogue decoration. Of course, if Sussman was working in 1735, he was working a full generation ahead of the creation of Galicia, and it is an anachronism to be using the adjective to describe him as an artist. And I don't mean to be a total pedant about this. I would say actually that it's rather interesting that the adjective Galician is powerful enough for the people creating the exhibit that they project it backwards a generation in order to make Sussman into a Galician artist. He came from Brody. He came from the territory that was about to become Galicia in the next generation. For Metternich, it's also a project and a national project. He wants to make true Galicians. Echte Galicia zu machen is part of his fantasy of what could be done with Galicia. And, I'm sorry, there's Metternich with the Echte Galicia. Sorry, I have a somewhat confusing presentation on the computer that I'm looking at. First, we have Krater, who has worked closely with the Josephine program, for whom Galicia is a project that is coming close to its final transformation, to its consummate transformation, to its Umschmelzung. And then for Metternich, for whom the Umschmelzung, right, is the creation of a Galician human type to inhabit the province of Galicia. First you create the province, then you create the Galician people to live in it. And if we were to move later into the 19th century and look at a figure like Stanisław Szczepanowski, the Galician entrepreneur, we see him already in his famous work Nędza Galicji, which established statistically the statistical poverty of Galicia. He has already discovered przeciętny Galicianin, an average Galician, by use of statistics, so that Metternich's fantasy of a national Galician is realized as a statistical average later in the 19th century, as a continuation of that project. Let me say a few words about Sachar Masa, who really was Galician, unlike Sussman, right, whose lifespan falls clearly into the Galician period, who was born in Lviv in 1836, the year after Dożywocie was produced there, and for whom Galicia is always a point of reference in his work. His legacy is one that transcends Galicia because, of course, Krafft-Ebing places masochism in the sexual psychopathology as what he understands as a universal sexual psychopathological complex, but it comes out of Sachar Masoch's novel Venus and Furs of 1870. But for Sachar Masoch, Lemberg is the point of reference. Lviv, it's about a widow from Lviv. She's said to be really beautiful, this widow, still very young. And for him, Galicia is already a homeland, right? He thinks of himself as a Galician. I used the first honorarium to hurry back to my homeland, Heimat. It was the summer of 1857, and I shed tears as I saw the first Galician peasant. And now when the post carriage arrived in Lemberg, there was still no train at that time, and I recognized the streets, the houses, the trees along the wall, the promenade of Lemberg. I began to weep like a child. My grandmother was still alive. The old family house looked exactly as it had when I left it 10 years before. It was like a fairy tale in which after 1,000 years' sleep, everything awakens exactly as it was before. The fairy tale aspect of this passage for me is that for Sachar Masoch, it's happened by the 50s. Galicia is a place that he identifies with so closely that he weeps tears upon coming to his homeland, a place that did not exist 100 years before. It's been created in the late 18th century, and it is already sentimentally powerful for him in the middle of the 19th century, as it will be and continue to be for us in the 20th century and even into the beginning of the 21st century. His legacy, of course, preserved in Lviv. His statue is there. There is a cafe in his honor. I won't spend time on that. I want to talk for a few minutes about the emperors, the Habsburg emperors, and the ways in which they leave their mark on Galicia and what it means to be Galician. Joseph II, who is one of the founding figures of Galicia, voici les Sarmats, is a figure who is remembered throughout the whole 19th century in Galicia, partly for his reforms of serfdom and partly for the issues of religious toleration that are important during his reign. The Kaiser Franz Josef, who reigns through the whole second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, will continue to be remembered through the whole 20th century and into the beginning of the 21st century. I want to emphasize that these are figures who make such a long-lasting mark on Galicia itself that they are recalled long after their reigns in association with Galicia. There we have a mineral water named after Franz Josef that continues into the 20th and 21st century. Of course, in the Viennese Café, as I pointed out, Franz Josef's picture remains on the wall a century after his death. I would want to emphasize that both of these emperors are very important for Galician Jews, Żydzi Galiciccy, as they are labeled in this illustration, or Galicianer, as we might know them in Yiddish. Metternich would probably have been surprised to discover that the people who were readiest to identify themselves as echte Galicier were the Jews of Galicia, for whom it became almost an anthropological ethnographic label, and I can remember it being used as such colloquially among Galician immigrants in New York City when I was a kid, and not just among scholars attempting to classify people from different regions. But to be a Galicianer was something that would have brought tears to the eyes in the same way that Zachar Massa cried about coming home to his Heimat. It would have brought tears to the eyes of, say, my grandfather, who was born in Tarnów, and for whom the idea of Galicianer connecting him to other Galicianer was a very powerful and sentimental one of powerful identification. Joseph, as I've said, stands behind a tradition of religious tolerance that makes him important to Jews throughout the 19th century. Franz Joseph stands behind the full civil emancipation of Jews in the Habsburg monarchy in the second half of the 19th century, following 1867. And I would point out to you that we've got his picture on the wall here again, as a Jewish father is sending off his sons to fight for the Habsburg monarchy, I think in World War I. I think this is a card from 1914. But the picture of Franz Joseph on the wall connects Jews to the monarchy through its institutions into the early 20th century. And we can see that figured over and over again in pictures of Habsburg soldiers, and other people have written about this in great detail. I want to turn to the figure of Franz Joseph, who comes to Krakow here. Oh, sorry, I've gone right past it. Where is it? Nope, let me pause. Let me say first that before I go to Franz Joseph, that what you're looking at here is a map from 1877 of Galicia in, I want to say in Hebrew, right, because it's Eretz Galician rather than Yiddish. But I'm not sure whether the place names reflect Yiddish as well as Hebrew in this case. And someone in this room will be able to do that for me better than I can. But I don't know who's going to be able to help me recover my PowerPoint. Can you give me a hand here? Thanks very much. Is it possible that I stepped on something here down below?
I don't want to blame you.
There we go.
Okay.
You've done it. Perfect. There's Franz Joseph entering Krakow in 1880. His visits to Galicia, which were irregular, were huge events, and he came more frequently for military maneuvers in eastern Galicia, even in the later years of his reign, but made large ceremonial visits in 1851, 1880, and again in 1894, which marked his presence in the province and were attended by all the different constituencies of Galicia who paid their respects to the emperor. What I put up here is a little sample of the Zeitschrift für Österreichische Volkskunde from the early 20th century. What I want to emphasize is that Franz Joseph reigned for such a long time that he was already the object of folklore, and Jewish folklore in particular. There are a series of magical legends about Franz Joseph that are published as folkloric studies in the early 20th century, often about his magical favor to the Jews. A subject of folkloric study then already in his own lifetime, and with a mystique that becomes equally large after his death in 1916. And again, if I think back to my grandparents' world in New York in the 1970s, they spoke of Franz Joseph as someone who was present vividly for them in emigration into the 1970s, half a century after his death. So he was someone who loomed very large for populations in Galicia in the early 20th century. I want to begin to say a few words about this headline, which I'll come back to. It comes from the Neue Freie Presse it's the beginning of a feuilleton in December of 1918. Nie war Lemberg so weit von uns wie heute. Lemberg has never been so far from us as it is today, right? It's the moment when Galicia is separated from the monarchy, when the monarchy ceases to exist, as it does in November of 1918, when Lviv becomes the site of Polish-Ukrainian war and the site of a pogrom against its Jewish population. And for the Neue Freie Presse, the liberal newspaper of Vienna, it's a measure of the remoteness of Lemberg, which had never been so far before. It was indeed connected by train by the time of 1918, indeed soon after Sacher-Masoch's time, but it suddenly began to feel very far away from Vienna. It feels far away in part because it's being liquidated. And I was a little surprised when it turned out that the term liquidation of Galicia is actually the term that is used in 1918. There's a Comisia Liquidacina, which goes into effect, whose purpose is to liquidate Galicia's existence over the course of integrating it into Polish institutions following 1918. Most interesting thing about the subject of Galicia to me is that it has a beginning and an end, 1772 and 1918. It's a province that is invented, I would say, almost without precedent in 1772, becomes so meaningful to its inhabitants that Sacher-Masoch is weeping over coming back to his Heimat in the 1850s, and then ceases to exist pretty definitively in 1918, so that we are here discussing its legacy now and what it delivers into the world as it ceases to exist in 1918. The map, my grandmother learned how to draw freehand in the schools of Galicia in the early 20th century. She could draw the shape of Galicia and once showed me that she could still do that 60 years later. What a useless skill to have learned in school, right? To draw the outline of a map of a province that was about to cease to exist forever. Its liquidation involves the division of East Galicia into the voivodstva, by which it's integrated into Poland, and then the reconception of it as Małopolska Wschodnia, right, Eastern Little Poland rather than Eastern Galicia. It's kind of purposefully unnamed as it's integrated into Poland, and thus liquidated over the course of that process. The actual division of Galicia as a whole takes place with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, in which a line is drawn right through Galicia, and it becomes part of different spheres, a Nazi sphere and a Soviet sphere, and the two halves are not rejoined after the war. As you know this story very, very well. Eastern Galicia will now become part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic following the war. Western Galicia will become part of communist Poland following the war. The Polish population of Lviv will move to Wrocław, where the Germans have just been expelled, and the statue of Fredro will follow them to Wrocław. I don't know what I did there. Look, you can do it from the back. Fantastic. I would want to point out that the integration of Eastern Galicia into Soviet Ukraine is also a work of liquidation. It's integrated as oblasti into Soviet Ukraine, so that Galicia itself becomes invisible on the administrative map, and the realm that once belonged to Franz Josef is in effect liquidated on the administrative map. So Adam Zagajewski, the Polish poet who died recently, quite young, in Krakow last year in 2021, has a famous poem called Going to Lvov, Jechać do Lvova. He's born in Lvov in 1945, is moved as an infant to Silesia with his family at the moment of the exchange of populations, which is also a form of ethnic cleansing. And his poem is about the fantasy of Lvov that occupies him throughout his life. It's a poem from the world of the 1980s. To go to Lvov, which station for Lvov? If not in a dream at dawn, when dew gleams on a suitcase, when express trains and bullet trains are being born, to leave in haste for Lvov, night or day, in September or in March, but only if Lvov exists. So for him, Lvov, like all of Galicia, has become immaterial. It's a fantasy place that belongs to his parents' world, and one that he doesn't know whether he will ever see again. He imagines the exchange of populations in reverse, getting on a train that would take him back to Lvov, if it really exists. And the if it really exists is something that hovers over the whole legacy of Galicia in the 20th century, following its geopolitical non-existence, what actually is graspable of Galicia. For Zagajewski, it is a fantasy that he pursues. Armies of burdocks, and below under the canvas of a Venetian cafe, the same cafes that Dublin hated. The snails converse about eternity, but the cathedral rises, you remember, so straight as Sunday, and white napkins and a bucket full of raspberries, standing on the floor, and my desire, which wasn't born yet, only gardens and weeds and the amber of Queen Anne cherries, and indecent Fredro. There was always too much of Lvov, za dużo Lvova. I'm going to come back to the raspberries, but I want you to notice that for him, the cafes and Fredro, right, are both present as part of his fantasy, as they are part of what Dublin finds troubling about Lvov when he visits it in 1924. Why must every city become Jerusalem, says Zagajewski, and every man a Jew, and now in a hurry, just pack always each day and go breathless, go to Lvov. After all, it exists, quiet and pure as a peach. It is everywhere. Lvov jest wszędzie. So it's Jerusalem for him. It's the site of messianic pilgrimage, and I'll come back to that. I want to emphasize these messianic aspects of Galicia, both from the very beginning, il est incroyable tout ce que l'on trouve à faire ici, right? And then by the 1980s, it exists quiet and pure as a peach. It is everywhere, right? Exists only in his mind, perfect and beautiful as a peach, but as a millenarian fantasy. The generation born in Galicia that goes out and creates the literature of Galicia after it ceases to exist. What a fascinating generation they are. Schultz writing in Polish, Agnon writing in Hebrew, Roth writing in German. I would say a few words about the ways in which they need to imagine Galicia, the ways in which it becomes their great subject after it has ceased to exist geopolitically. For Roth, of course, in Radetzky Marsh, but above all in the famous story, The Bust of the Emperor, in which he imagines im früheren Ostgalicien, im heutigen Polen, in former Eastern Galicia, in today's Poland, very far from the only train track that connects Przemysl and Brody, lies the little village of Lopatine, right? It's a geographically precise fairy tale setting for a story about what happens if you try to show a bust of Franz Josef in post-Habsburg Galicia, that is to say, in the Republic of Poland, when Galicia has already been liquidated. Busts are gone. There's a postage stamp. The postage stamps of Franz Josef also are gone. They would only be present for you if you were busy collecting them as a boy. That might be Bruno Schulz. Świat był naówczas ograniczony Franciszkiem Józefem. The world was bounded by Franz Josef in those days. On each postage stamp, on each coin, on each postmark, he's remembering back to his childhood. His picture established the invariability of the world, the immovable dogma of its unequivocalness. Such is the world, and there are no worlds but this, proclaimed the seal with the imperial and royal old man on it. This is Schulz writing in the 1930s, looking back to his childhood in the 1890s and the early 20th century, across the moment at which Galicia ceased to exist, and recovering a world that was defined by Franz Josef. The murals that were discovered in 2001 in Drohobych, painted as frescoes by Schulz in 1941, 1942, during the Nazi occupation, in the service of the Gestapo officer who he had to work for in the vain hope of surviving. The frescoes that were discovered in 2001 in situ, and then very quickly moved from there to Jerusalem, to the Yad Vashem, where they are kept now. I was there visiting them this morning, was very moved by them. I was the only one with them for half an hour. Hillary Clinton wasn't there. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, and I don't have time to develop this, but I would be interested in writing about it, is the ways in which a particular kind of fairy tale narrative, because they are fairy tale frescoes, is relevant to the whole telling of the story of Galicia after Galicia. Here's Drohobych, which is Schulz's town, and here's how he writes about it in the 1930s. Wysobotnia popołudnia wychodziłem z matką na spacer. He's a flaneur in Drohobych. On Saturday afternoons, I used to go for a stroll with my mother. The market square was empty and white-hot, swept by hot winds like a biblical desert. On the corner of Striska, we passed within the shadow of the chemist's shop a large jar of raspberry juice. We've seen the raspberries once already in Zagajewski. In the wide window symbolized the coolness of balms which can relieve all kinds of pain. I want you to notice the intensity of nostalgia here. After we passed a few more houses, the street ceased to maintain any pretense of urbanity, like a man returning to his little village who piece by piece strips off his Sunday best, lowly changing back into a peasant as he gets closer to home. He's a flaneur with only a few blocks to stroll, and then he encounters the Nędza Galicji of Szczepanowski, right, because the town comes to an end, and he is his flaneurdom, right, is bounded by the central streets. Aftermath of Galicia, we see its legacy in all kinds of domains, right? Mineral water in Poland, Ukrainian soccer, Jewish genealogy websites. In New York, there's a construction company, and I like that Galicia is marked as a danger by the construction company. And dangerously nostalgic, we could think about that. It's also an object for consumption in museum exhibits and academic conferences, as we know, and treated as a mythology, which I think is also interesting. I want to say something about its survival in New York at J. Baczynski on 2nd Avenue, the East Village Meat Market. Look at the identification online. This East Village Polish, correction, Ukrainian butcher is all that's left of a cadre that included 2 other East European butcher shops in the immediate vicinity. I once spent a while talking to the butcher who wouldn't admit to being either Polish or Ukrainian when I spoke to him, because of course Baczynski he's Ukrainian, wants to sell pork sausage to both Poles and Ukrainians. It's therefore a trans-Galician phenomenon, except, of course, that 10% of the population of Galicia would not have eaten pork sausage. And 2nd Avenue was a crucial avenue for the Jews in New York City. It was the Jewish Broadway. It was where the Yiddish theater existed in the early 20th century. In Poland, we might look at this nostalgia shop that emerges, I think, at the very beginning of the 21st century, maybe the end of the 20th century. Krakowski Kredens, and I don't know if you can read the writing underneath it, which says Tradycja Galicyjska. It's a Krakow cupboard, right, working in the Galician tradition. Hams and sausages, very important in that Galician tradition again. But what is that tradition exactly? I like this photograph through the window because it gives you a sense of how insubstantial that tradition is if you try to grasp it as a ham, say, if you try to make it into a material commodity. You can even see the reflection of me, the grandson of Galicians, right, taking the picture on the other side of the glass, right? It's a hard tradition to grasp substantially in the aftermath of Galicia's geopolitical existence. In Krakowski Kredens, we have hidden tastes that will take you back to the past, as in the spirit of Proustian nostalgia, when picnics on Planty used to be a Sunday tradition, attended by wealthy burghers of Krakow with sensitive palate and taste for haute cuisine. Tidbits that were tasted belonged to the best ones in Galicia. I can't remember exactly how you translate borówka, berries, into English, but they're part of the Tradycja Galicyjska here, graspable in a way that's supposed to make you cry the way that Sacher Masoch cries upon returning to Galicia. And do they have a raspberry syrup? Yes, they definitely do have a raspberry syrup for Bruno Schulz. It's one of the Galician flavors that Krakowski Kredens gives us. And what I'd want to emphasize here is that Galicia becomes a kind of vehicle for general nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for the age of our grandparents, represented here in Victorian costumes with bicycles, as antique as Fredro with his goose feather pen. It channels nostalgia. Very different from the idea of Halicina making Ukrainian trendy, Ukraine's coolest radio station as of 2013, let alone Volodymyr Kosterko's attempt to capture the relationship between Halicina and Ukraina through this painting, which would not really represent the world of our grandparents very effectively in a nostalgic way. Don't have time to talk about it now. I want to come back to how far away Lemberg seemed in 1918. What I'd want to say about this is it's much farther away now, more than 100 years later. But when I was born in 1957, it was barely gone by a generation. Not even 40 years had passed. It's receded so much further during my lifetime. That's me in college, starting college in 1974. There were professors all around me in the 1970s who came out of a Galician tradition. There's my Polish professor on the left, Wiktor Weintraub, who was trained in the Krakow Jagiellonian University in the 1920s, immediately post-Galician Jagiellonian University. There's Omelian Prycak, who was my history professor at Harvard in the 1970s, who came out of the post-Galician Lviv University in the 1930s. They were people for whom Galicia was part of their formation in the sense that they were trained in institutions that had been created very recently, that had been very recently Galician institutions. Weintraub was a famous Mickiewicz scholar, but he also wrote Odreja do Boja, and it was through Boy that he first introduced me to Krakow at the beginning of the 20th century and the world of Galicia. Prycak was a great historian who created the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard in 1973. And I want you to notice this screenshot I did of the Wikipedia entry that tells us that he was born on 7th of April 1919, Lucca, Sambir County, Austrian Galicia, even though Austrian Galicia did not exist in 1919. For Wikipedia at that time, and it has since been corrected to the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, but Initially, whoever wrote that article believed that he should best be assigned to Austrian Galicia. There's the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where I received a part of my education in the 1970s, and there it is on wheels being moved away up Mass Ave in the early 21st century. I always think of this picture. I find it very moving, and I think again of the portability, the movability of the Galician legacy, the impossibility of pinning it down. We can think of it as a legacy on wheels. Svetlana Boym, great scholar who died tragically young, wrote that European, right, she's actually quoting Kundera here, European, one who is nostalgic for Europe. And Svetlana writes, Europa was a transnational idea based on a civic ideal of the association of free cities. Sarajevo, Ljubljana, Budapest, Belgrade, Zagreb, Plovdiv, Timisoara, Bucharest, Prague, Krakow, Lvov, Lviv, Vilnius, Tallinn, Leningrad, Petersburg, Gdańsk, Danzig. The list can go on. Alternative thinking urban dwellers in these cities could find more in common among themselves than with their own countries. In the countries of the former Soviet bloc and Yugoslavia, nostalgia for Europe was a way of resisting the Soviet or Tito-style version of official internationalism as well as nationalism. This nostalgia for Europe intersects in interesting ways with the nostalgia for Galicia. And we can think of that nostalgia for Galicia as being backwards looking, as with the portrait of Franz Josef on the cafe wall, and the nostalgia for Europe being very forward looking, as when we look at this photograph from Euromaidan. Let me conclude with Zagajewski. Why must every city become Jerusalem and every man a Jew? Well, because cities are points of reference for thinking mythologically about the past and thinking prospectively, prophetically, and in fantasy millenarian ways about the future. Thank you very much.